From the 1930s all the way through the 1950s, one of the major points of controversy in connection with the Soviet Union was the question of the so-called forced labor camps, or, to use the Nazi term, concentration camps that existed. Of course, in the very early days, the Soviets claimed that they had places to re-educate people, to form people into a new socialist mode of work, but they would never admit that there was any such thing as a forced labor camp or a concentration camp in the Soviet Union. Of course, in the days of the Cold War, in the late 40s and particularly during the 50s, this was a constant theme reiterated over and over again by Western propaganda and Western information about the terrible conditions of the concentration camps in the Soviet Union. And the reply always was, no, these things don't exist. These are simply figments of the bourgeois, reactionary, Western American imagination. They simply do not exist. And I will confess personally that in the 1950s, when I was very young, I often wondered about this. Whether there was any kind of truth to the Soviet denial of the forced labor camps. And then, in 1962, a book came out which hit the world, I think it'd be fair to say, with the force of a bomb. The book was One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. The author, of course, was the man about whom we're going to be talking, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who gave, literally in very precise and rather calmly related detail, exactly what it felt like to be in one of these camps, because of course he himself had been in one for many years. And to everyone's amazement, this book was published by the Soviets themselves. In short, all of a sudden, having denied for something like 2 generations the existence of such camps, all of a sudden the Soviet government itself was admitting that there were such camps, that the accusations had been true right along. This really took hold of the world's imagination in a very big way, and I suppose you can probably imagine what it felt like being in the Soviet Union when this suddenly came out. The book was, first of all, published in the form of a literary magazine. And of course, when people in the Soviet Union heard that there was a book which actually described the forced labor camps, they rushed to buy up the magazine. Within 2 days, you simply couldn't get a copy of it. How did this come about? Well, the manuscript had been submitted to a Soviet poet named Tverdovsky, a man who was in good status both with the party and in public opinion because he'd written a very popular poem during the war about Russian soldiers. Tverdovsky saw it was very well written and took it to the editor of the most liberal Soviet journal of that day, and he was so impressed that he took personally to Khrushchev, at that time the Soviet premier. Khrushchev later on admitted this was one of the few literary works he managed to read without sticking himself with pins to avoid falling asleep. And of course the resulting publication, as I said before, stunned the Soviet reading public and the world. It was obviously published because at that point Khrushchev was going through this de-Stalinization campaign. He was trying to tear down a bit the view of Stalin as a sort of a demigod which had been built all through the days of the latter days of the Soviet dictator's existence. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich views the Soviet penal world through the eyes of a former collective farm worker and soldier in World War II. According to the book, the Nazi soldiers captured him, he escaped back to Soviet lines, and then the Soviets arrested him and accused him of being a spy. The idea was, of course, he would not have been able to escape had he not agreed to be a spy for the Nazis. This was a fate common to thousands of other Soviet soldiers at the time. As a matter of fact, in the book itself, he describes how Ivan, who is not a very educated man, he's been a worker on a collective farm for many years, he didn't have much of a formal education. He and his interrogator are trying to figure out what sort of crimes he committed that he could be arrested for. And of course, together they had to put their heads together in order to try to figure it out, only obviously trying to show in this the total falseness of thousands and even millions of accusations that were made in so-called Soviet justice. In the camp itself, Ivan Denisovich meets many different kinds of people, many of them far more educated and, for that matter, experienced in the world than he is. As he sees them, we get a sense of the population and mores in this vast archipelago of camps. You know that later on, Solzhenitsyn would write a very famous book, Gulag Archipelago, or the Gulag Archipelago, as if there were a huge archipelago of forced labor camps. Gulag is the abbreviation for forced labor camp in the Soviet Union. Because we're seeing this through Ivan's uneducated eyes, we get a sense that this is really true. He obviously doesn't have either the talent or the imagination to make this up as a writer, but rather what we're seeing is something that actually happened. And Solzhenitsyn is very skillful in this novel to give you a sense of the genuine reality, the genuine actuality of the events that you're looking at. So as we see each one of these characters, we really become involved with them as if it were somebody we could very easily know. There's the captain, a former commander of a Soviet naval ship, who was arrested. Why? Because he received a Christmas card from a former British sea captain and allied during World War II. You understand that this captain had, under military orders, obviously, had been working with the British, together with the British, against the Germans in World War II. He was really a war hero. And simply because of the fact that the British captain had so little sense as to send him a Christmas card later on, the captain was arrested. Now, this captain is a man of no nonsense. He's accustomed to command. He's accustomed to telling other people what to do. He can't keep silent when he hears the nonsense in the camp. In one particular incident, the commander of the camp, a man named Volkovoy, of course the very name means a wolf, Solzhenitsyn trying to show the wolf-like character of the people who ran these camps, learned that the men had been given extra shirts to protect them against the bitter cold of Siberia. But since this was not in the regulations, this is against the rules, he demanded that the men take off these shirts, and he meant not only that they take off the shirts, but that they remove them out in the cold, so that they had to take off their outer clothing, which was protecting them, holding in a certain amount of warmth, lose that warmth, take off those shirts, and then put on the other clothing. This was a terrible thing to do to men who were poorly nourished, were engaged in very, very heavy labor in very, very cold weather. So the former naval captain, Buinovsky is his name, turns to the commander of the camp and says, "You're no real communist, you're no real socialist, look what you're doing to these men." And of course, that's the worst accusation he can make against the director of a Soviet camp, that he's not a good communist. He said, "All right, we'll take care of you." And it turns out that when the day is finished, after the man has done a full day's work, he is going to be taken to a cold cell. Now, probably most people in this country don't really know what a cold cell is all about. This was a cell that was kept at a temperature something like 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And the prisoner was put in there without any outer clothing, without any protection. The prisoner was given one loaf of bread and a certain amount of water to eat over the whole day. Now, you understand that when you're living in a situation where the outside temperature is that much lower than your inner temperature. Remember, the inner temperature is 98.6, and this is 50, so the difference is considerable. The body has to maintain body heat. In order to maintain body heat, of course, it starts to do extra movements within the body, and the first thing you know, after an hour or so, the body begins to shiver, and shiver helplessly. In this situation, one uses up the calories that one eats much, much faster than you do in normal life, and that loaf of bread is barely enough to keep you alive, much less to nourish you in that time. 10 days of this, and if one survives at all, one comes out as a cripple for life. And this is the punishment this heroic captain is going to get for having said what he said to the camp commander, which was only the truth, which was only an honestly expressed truth. There's something very moving and very touching about the courage and the force of this commander, and of course the result is you feel terribly the pain that he's going to be going through. Then at one point, Ivan Denisovich thinks that he's sick, and he goes into the clinic to be examined by a medic. It turns out that the medic who examines him has had no medical training at all. He's a poet who was arrested for his poetry. The camp commander likes the verse, so he gives the man a lighter job on the inside, the man pretending to be a medic, attending to the men. In this confinement, he can write poetry, which would be immediately condemned on the outside. There's something remarkably ironic about the fact that the only place in Russia where one can write the kind of poetry that one wants to write at that particular point, remember this is now in the 1940s, the only place that one can write that kind of poetry is in a camp where one has been arrested for writing that kind of poetry. I have many Russian friends who've been through exactly the same kind of experience. This was a very typical experience for poets at that time. And of course, again, it tells you something about the attempts at intellectual life under the rule of a man like Stalin. Then there are two intellectuals from Moscow whose educated Russian Ivan can barely understand, if at all. Ivan, of course, talks the kind of Russian that was spoken on the collective farm out in the middle of Russia. And of course, to these people, it seems like Muscovites, who speak, after all, educated Russian, are speaking an entirely different language. As a matter of fact, at one point he says, these Muscovites sniff each other out like dogs. It's as if they're not only not speaking the same language, they're not even the same kind of living beings as people who speak the kind of language that Ivan Denisovich speaks. Ivan is sent to bring in their lunch. They're working, of course, in a warm place, and not like people like Ivan who have to work out in the cold. They're carrying out a polemic about films by the great Soviet cinematographer Sergei Eisenstein. The argument about aesthetic judgment versus political decency goes way over Ivan's head, but of course he does bring them lunch. And in the course of the argument, we get some sense about how people in Soviet Russia argued about art. Eisenstein had made several films in an attempt to please Stalin. These films, by the way, are very popular in this country. One can easily see them. By now, of course, they're on videotape. The films, of course, were about Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible was a ferocious tyrant who lived back in the 17th century. It's one of the Muscovite Tsars. And of course, he had a police force which murdered thousands and perhaps even tens of thousands of people. He was known as a rather cruel and terrible Tsar, but yet at the same time it was he who brought Russia together and brought Russia out from under the so-called Tatar yoke when his army attacked at Kazan. We talked about this, of course, in the early lectures of the course. Stalin obviously wanted Ivan the Terrible to be shown, unlike the way revolutionary propaganda had shown him before, as one of those terrible, cruel Tsars they're trying to get away from. No, Stalin wanted him to be shown as a great master of the country who brought the country together through terror and made Russia a great country, just as Stalin wanted people to look at him. So the first two sections of this film please Stalin mightily, the first section pleased Stalin mightily, but the second section, which showed the cruelty of Ivan, rather upset Stalin. The result was, luckily for Eisenstein, he had a heart attack before they were able to arrest him. What these intellectuals in the camp are arguing is whether or not Eisenstein made a good movie simply because from the aesthetic point of view, it was a good film. One of the people making the argument says, no, you can't call it a good film if it praised a hideous dictator like Stalin. You can't call it a good film if it shows good things about a man who actually was a terrible historical character. Truth is the most important thing. Aesthetics comes second. Whereas the other man says, no, you don't judge a film by the theme or by the truth or non-truth of what it's saying. You rather judge it by how well the film is made, by the aesthetics of the film. Of course, this is an argument that went on in many different places and many different times in the Soviet Union. Ivan Denisovich doesn't have any understanding whatsoever, and yet Solzhenitsyn is showing you that even in the camps, such abstract and very powerful themes were discussed by the people there. That in the camps there was a tremendously high level of intellectual discourse and discussion. Then there's another character, Alyoshka the Baptist, who actually rejoices that he's in the camp. Of course, he's been arrested because the country is supposed to be atheist, and they don't want to have religious people. And at that particular time, religious people are arrested and put in the camps. But here he is. He rejoices that he's in the camp, detached from the transient pleasures of the world, able to concentrate his total energies on prayer and supplication to the almighty ruler of the Protestant Christian universe. Ivan says, now, wait a minute. He says, I did hear something about prayer. Ivan, of course, has been brought up in Soviet times, but coming from the countryside, he still knows something about the church, something about prayer. He said, I've prayed many times, but it doesn't do any good. It doesn't do any more good than writing complaints and sending them to the camp administration. You still have to suffer. What's the point of prayer if it can't help you get out of the situation? And of course, Alyosha replies to him as a good Christian would. He said, look, you have to know what to pray for. You don't pray to God for things that you want in life. You don't pray to God to try to get you out of a bad situation. You rather pray to God for the sake of prayer, for the sake of connecting the own inner part of your person to the universe which is out there. That's the genuine part of it. You should be glad that you're in the camp. You should be glad that they don't listen to your trying to get out or making your situation better, because this will eventually make you a better human being and a better Christian.